Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back. Remember where we left off? We were talking about the plight of Chief Joseph and his people and the aftermath of the Battle at Bear Paw Mountain. So to pick up where we left off, Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce were now treated as prisoners of war. Initially, they were held in Kansas, then they were relocated to even worse conditions in the present-day state of Oklahoma, in a prisoner of war camp. Now, Joseph and his people had to live there from 1877 until ultimately, as we'll find out, they were relocated out of that POW camp in 1885. Now, Joseph, who felt betrayed, constantly sent letters to the President of the United States, to Congress, requesting that somebody do something about how his people and himself were treated after the surrender at Bear Paw Mountain. Ultimately, in the early 1880s, Joseph is brought to Washington, D.C. to testify in front of a congressional committee that's investigating the plight of Joseph and his people. Because at the same time, as we'll find out, an Indian rights movement is rising up in the East. So, Joseph is taken by train to Washington, D.C., and then he's going to testify for several days in front of a congressional committee, where he's going to talk about how he believes he was betrayed, how the promises of General Howard were broken, and that his people need to be returned back to the Bitterroot Valley in the state of Washington, as he was originally promised. Now, his testimony was quite moving to a lot of members of Congress, and this testimony is all contained in the congressional record, which is a record of everything that's spoken in the halls of Congress. And it's where I found these words that I'm going to read you an excerpt of Chief Joseph's actual testimony to a congressional committee. So let me read you part of this, because these words are pretty forceful and pretty moving, and I'll give you an idea of how brilliant Chief Joseph really was. In this particular testimony or speech in front of Congress, Joseph said the following: "I only ask of the government to be treated as all other men are treated. If I cannot go to my home, let me have a home in some country where my people will not die so fast. I would like to go to the Bitterroot Valley. There my people would be healthy. Where they are now, they are dying. 3 have died since I left my camp to come to Washington. When I think of our condition, my heart is heavy. I see men of my race treated as outlaws and driven from country to country or shot down like animals. I know that my race must change. We cannot hold our own with the white men as we are. We only ask an even chance to live as other men live. We ask to be recognized as men. We ask that the same law shall work alike on all men. If the Indian breaks the law, punish him by the law. If the white man breaks the law, punish him also. Let me be a free man, free to travel, free to stop, free to work, free to trade where I choose, free to choose my own teachers, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to think and talk and act for myself, and I will obey every law or submit to the penalty. Whenever the white man treats the Indian as they treat each other, we will have no more wars." That's a pretty moving excerpt of Joseph's testimony in front of Congress. And it did the trick. Congress agreed to relocate Chief Joseph and his people to the Bitterroot Valley in 1885. They finally got to leave that prisoner of war camp, and they went to the Bitterroot Valley, where they thrived again, raising Appaloosa horses, living like they always had, not in the same exact place, but in a pretty similar place. And they were in the shadow of a fort that you can locate on your map up in northeastern Washington state, Fort Colville. So, Joseph lived, and his people lived near Fort Colville, and Joseph always got along with the troops at Fort Colville, who were instructed to keep an eye on him. Pretty easy duty. These people aren't going to cause any problems. And Joseph got to be pretty good friends with some of the officers in the fort who he reported to. And one thing that Joseph had always asked of these officers was if before he got too old and died, he wanted to go back to his old homeland of the Wallow Valley one more time just to see it before he was gone. Finally, these officers got permission to take Joseph back down on a trip where they'd escort him to the Wallow Valley in northeastern Oregon. And they're going to do this in 1904. So they go back to the valley, and Joseph obviously doesn't recognize it. The entire valley is all now small 160-acre farms where homesteaders have settled throughout the valley. It's still a green, lush place, but it's not open pasture land for Appaloosas anymore. One thing that Joseph wanted to do while he was there is he wanted to visit the graves of his mother and his father. His father was also a chief of the Nez Perce, so he went to pay tribute to his father at his grave, and when he went to the grave, he was astounded. Grave robbers had dug up the bones of his mother and father and robbed the graves. Joseph's father was a chief. He was buried with a lot of sacred items. Grave robbers took these sacred native items and stole them from the grave. Joseph basically was not the same man after that. He was depressed. They marched north back to the Bitterroot Valley in the shadow of Fort Colville. And later on that same year in 1904, Chief Joseph will pass away. Now, on the official death certificate that was filled out by the Army physician at Fort Colville for Chief Joseph, in the line where the doctor is supposed to put cause of death, this physician, who was obviously also a close acquaintance of Chief Joseph from his time near Fort Colville, wrote cause of death, a broken heart. Now, I know that sounds a little bit hokey, but people can actually die from a broken heart. I've known people who have, elderly people who lose their companions or whatever. Chief Joseph felt like he betrayed his father. His grave was scattered on the grounds, robbed, and Joseph felt like he could never make that up to his departed father. So, that's the sad saga of Chief Joseph. But what we want to move on to next, as I mentioned before, in the early 1880s, an Indians' rights advocacy movement will rise up in the East because all these horrible things are happening to Native people out West, and some people obviously believe it's wrong. And what spurred this on in a very important event in this whole Indian rights movement was a famous book written by a female author, Helen Hunt Jackson. The title of this book is A Century of Dishonor. Now, here's what the theme of this book is. She publishes it in 1881. That's the 100th year since the Revolutionary War ended in 1781, and the brand new government that took over in the United States that replaced the British colonial government, the Articles of Confederation, took over. So that also is sort of a 100-year centennial of government in America in 1881, from 1781 to 1881. She's examining Indian policy for the first 100 years of the American government and its existence. And obviously, she's not impressed. The title of her book kind of sums it up: A Century of Dishonor. She argues that Native people have been treated like animals, treaty after treaty has been broken, and something has to be done to save these people before it's too late. A lot of people read this book, and it spurs this movement as well as other occurrences that are happening out west. Groups rise up like the Women's National Indian Association, the Indian Rights Association, which was housed in Philadelphia, and all of them start lobbying Congress and fighting for Native American rights. Now, unfortunately, these Indian right advocates pursue a policy that isn't quite as deadly as outright genocide, but is also harmful to Native American people. The policy that they push the government to adopt is a policy known as assimilation. And what that really means is the best course of action to preserve Native American people before they're exterminated out west is to have them assimilate into American society. Sort of have them blend in and become Americans, and no one will really notice that they're Native American people. And the best way to do that in their minds is turn them into small farmers. Now, on paper, this might sound like a pretty good idea, especially if it preserves these people from extinction. But obviously, people like the Plains Indians wanted no part of being farmers. They were hunters. And you can't just transform people overnight like this. But there was this thought it could happen. And this is what they start to push for. Now, a lot of people condemn these early Indian rights advocates for pursuing this policy of assimilation. I really can't do that. I see them as a group where their hearts were in the right place. They just went about their goals the wrong way. So I'm not going to condemn them, because the alternative was wipe Native American people off the face of the earth, like a lot of people like Colonel Shivington were trying to do. So this is a much better course of action. It's not the best, but it's better. So, one unfortunate thing that evolves out of this movement are the Indian boarding schools. This was part of the government program of assimilation, taking young children from Native American tribes where Indians were defeated, placed on reservations, and supposedly they were going to provide them with a free education at these Indian boarding schools in the East. The most famous of these Indian boarding schools was the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. It was a school organized by a former Army colonel by the name of Richard Pratt. Now, these Indian boarding schools ended up being horrible places. They'd take these young Native American children from their families, put them on a train, send them back east, bring them into these schools, and the first thing they'd do to these young kids is they'd have them stripped naked, they'd delouse them, they assumed all of them had lice, which was false, they'd shave their heads to rid them of lice, then they'd issue them surplus uniforms, many of which were from the Civil War. And then they'd tell them from that point forward, the only language they could speak was English, and if they spoke their native tongue or did any of their native rituals, they would be punished, which they were. A lot of these Indian children died at these schools from being scared to death, being homesick, being a fish out of water, so to speak. These were horrible places. And what the goal was to teach the young Indian boys to become farmers and the young Indian girls to become homemakers or wives of farmers. And as Richard Pratt, the founder of the Carlisle Indian School, said in an interview about what the purpose of this particular institution was, he said, quote, "Our purpose is to kill the Indian to save the man." They wanted to take Indian culture out of these people. Well, as we'll find out, that's impossible. But boy, did they try. Now, what ultimately evolves out of this Indian rights movement is an act of Congress passed in 1877, the Dawes Act. Now, the Dawes Act was, as far as Indian rights groups were concerned, the final piece of the puzzle of assimilation. And what it did was completely dismantle Indian reservations. It took the land that Indians had held due to treaties that they signed with the government, dissolved the reservation that they used to own communally, and then divided it up into 160-acre parcels, which they distributed to individual Indians. So if you were a family of 4, you would get approximately 260-acre plots, plus a couple more 50-acre plots for every child you had. You were given equipment, and you were told to transform your lives and become farmers and farm these individual plots of land instead of them owning them communally as a tribe on a reservation. So the reservation system as we know it was dismantled and divided up among individual Indians. Now, what's going to happen with all this is it's going to create a lot of surplus land. In fact, Native American people, before the Dawes Act, controlled about 150 million acres of land. When they divided that up into 160-acre plots, it created land that was surplus, which was then turned over to the federal government, and the surplus amounted to over 90 million acres of land. And according to this law, that land could then be sold to anybody who wanted to buy it. The proceeds of the sale would buy farming equipment for the Indian people and fund those Indian boarding schools. So Native American people were taking what was their own land, being forced to sell it to fund a program that they didn't necessarily agree with and to fund these schools where they were indoctrinating their children. The Dawes Act was a complete failure. So much so that by the time of the Great Depression, one of the things Franklin Roosevelt will do during the New Deal is he will reestablish Indian reservations, end the Dawes Act once and forever, and try to allow Native American people to live by their own cultures once again before it was too late and they died off in the Great Depression. We'll talk about the actions of FDR when we get to the Great Depression and the New Deal. FDR is the one who saved the reservation system that still exists today. But there was a period from 1887 until the 1930s where Indian reservations didn't exist because of the dismantling of them by the Dawes Act. So, that's what happened to Joseph and his people. The Indian rights movement that emerged sort of at the same time. So, when I come back for another lecture, the subject that I'm going to talk about is the final chapter of Native American history in the West. What happened at the famous massacre at Wounded Knee in 1889-1890, which will be the end of a chapter as far as the American West is concerned. So, that's it for lecture installment number 2. Thanks for listening to me. I really miss being in the classroom and being in front of all you guys and delivering my regular lectures, but we got to do what we got to do, don't we? And my advice to you is stay home and be safe, and this thing will get over faster. We really want to put this virus to an end in the North Country, and the best way to do that is stay home. All I do is drive 7 miles to the library, talk to you here all by myself, then I'll get in my truck and drive right back home. I suggest you guys do the same. Take care, be safe, see you next time.